Sergeant Emily Thompson stood at the bustling airport terminal, a sea of people moving around her in every direction. The hum of conversations, the mechanical whir of rolling suitcases, and the constant announcements over the PA system barely registered in her mind. She was in a different headspace, caught between the world she was leaving behind and the one she was about to re-enter. The military uniform she wore, a crisp, pressed representation of her rank and service, set her apart from the civilians around her. Some people threw her appreciative glances, while others avoided eye contact entirely. But Emily wasn't here for the attention. She was just another traveler trying to make it home. Home. The word felt strange to her now. After months of deployment in Iraq, returning to civilian life wasn't as simple as stepping off a plane and walking into the arms of her loved ones. She had seen too much, experienced too much. The war had left its mark on her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Still, the thought of seeing her family filled her with a quiet sense of hope. There was solace in the idea of returning to familiar faces, of sitting around a dinner table with people who knew her before the uniform and all that it represented. She glanced at her boarding pass. First class. It had been a surprise, a small luxury afforded to her as a thank you for her service. Normally, she would have waved off such a gesture, preferring to stay out of the spotlight. But today was different. Today, she allowed herself this one comfort. Her legs ached from the long journey she had already endured, sleepless nights in military transports, hours spent in foreign airports waiting for the next leg of her trip. A seat in first class felt like a small reprieve, a final stretch of peace before she had to confront the emotions that came with returning home. As the boarding announcement crackled over the loudspeakers, Emily gathered her things and made her way to the gate. The line for first-class passengers was short, and she quickly found herself stepping onto the plane. The flight attendants greeted her warmly, though she noticed the way their eyes lingered on her uniform, a mixture of respect and curiosity in their expressions. She offered them a polite nod and moved down the aisle, searching for her seat. She finally located it, 8A, a window seat. The leather was soft and inviting, the space more than enough to stretch out and relax for the long flight ahead. Emily stowed her backpack in the overhead compartment and sat down, exhaling a sigh of relief as she sank into the seat. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a sense of ease. She wasn't in a war zone anymore. She was on her way home. Just as she closed her eyes, hoping to get some rest, she felt a presence beside her. She opened her eyes and glanced up to see a tall man standing in the aisle, his sharply tailored suit and polished shoes indicating that he was someone of means. His eyes flicked from her face to her uniform and then to the seat number above her. "Excuse me," he said, his tone crisp. "I think you're in the wrong seat." Emily blinked, confused for a moment. She checked her boarding pass again, 8A, first class. She looked back at the man and said, "No, this is my seat." The man frowned, clearly unimpressed. "I think you must be mistaken. First class is overbooked sometimes. Maybe they moved you. You should check with the flight attendant." Emily felt the tension in her shoulders immediately. She had been through this before. People questioning her, doubting her because she didn't fit their image of someone who belonged in first class. The man didn't explicitly say it, but it was clear in his tone, in the way he looked at her uniform. She wasn't the kind of person he expected to see sitting up front. "I'm not mistaken," she said calmly. "This is my seat." For a moment, the man just stood there, his jaw tightening as if he was debating whether to push the issue further. Finally, with a huff of irritation, he sat down in the seat next to her, his movements sharp and exaggerated. He settled in, but not without muttering under his breath, just loud enough for Emily to hear. "I didn't know they were giving out first-class seats to anyone these days." Emily clenched her jaw, feeling a surge of frustration, but she kept her cool. She had dealt with this kind of attitude before. She wasn't going to let some stranger's opinion ruin her peace of mind. She turned her gaze out the window, trying to focus on the world outside rather than the unpleasant man beside her. As the plane taxied down the runway, Emily's thoughts drifted. She knew what the man thought of her. To him, she was just some soldier, someone who had no business sitting in first class. He didn't see the long nights she had spent on the battlefield, the friends she had lost, or the weight of responsibility she carried every day. He didn't know about the missions she had led, the lives she had saved, or the sacrifices she had made for people like him, people who would never understand the full scope of what it meant to serve. She took a deep breath, trying to let it go. It wasn't worth it to engage with someone like him. Her mind wandered to her family, the people waiting for her on the other side of this journey. Her mother, who had sent care packages filled with her favorite snacks, handwritten letters, and photos of home. Her younger sister, who had texted her nearly every day, even if she couldn't always reply. Her father, who had served in the military himself, and understood, at least in part, what she was going through. They were the ones who mattered, not the judgment of a stranger. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Emily pulled out her notebook. She had always found writing to be a way of processing her thoughts, especially when she was feeling overwhelmed. Today was no different. She flipped to a fresh page and began writing, her pen moving across the paper in steady strokes. She didn't write about the man beside her, not directly. Instead, she wrote about what it meant to serve, what it meant to be part of something larger than yourself. She wrote about the comrades she had lost, about the camaraderie and the bond that only those who had been to war could truly understand. She wrote about the exhaustion that came with constantly being on high alert, always prepared for the worst. And she wrote about the strength it took to keep going, day after day, when everything around you seemed to be falling apart. The turbulence began almost as soon as the plane reached cruising altitude. It wasn't unusual, and Emily had experienced much worse during her military flights. The plane rattled slightly, causing a few gasps from nervous passengers. She glanced around, noticing a woman across the aisle, gripping the armrest, her knuckles white with fear. Without thinking, Emily reached across the aisle, offering the woman a reassuring smile. "It's okay," she said softly. "This happens all the time. It's nothing to worry about." The woman nodded, though she still looked uneasy. Emily kept talking, her voice calm and steady, guiding the woman through her fear. Slowly, the woman relaxed, her grip on the armrest loosening. From the corner of her eye, Emily noticed Richard watching her. He had been silent since their initial exchange, but now there was something different in his expression. His earlier disdain seemed to have softened, replaced by curiosity or perhaps even respect. He didn't say anything, but Emily could feel the shift in the air between them. As the turbulence eased and the flight returned to its smooth course, Emily went back to her writing. She didn't know what, if anything, would come of this small act of kindness, but she didn't dwell on it. For her, it was simply a part of who she was, someone who helped others, whether they were soldiers or civilians, strangers or friends. The man beside her remained silent, his earlier arrogance diminished by the quiet strength he had witnessed in Emily. The turbulence intensified, causing the plane to lurch unexpectedly. Drinks spilled, and the soft murmur of passengers turned into a chorus of anxious whispers. The flight attendants moved quickly, securing their carts and bracing themselves for the rough patch of air. Emily sat calmly, her body instinctively tensing and relaxing with each jolt, as if she were riding out a wave in the field rather than sitting on a commercial flight thousands of feet above the ground. She had been through far worse. To her left, Richard gripped the armrests tightly, his face rigid as he stared straight ahead. His earlier bravado had disappeared, replaced by a tense silence. His hands, large and manicured, were shaking slightly, betraying his discomfort. He was trying to hide it, but Emily could see the anxiety etched in the lines of his forehead, the tightness of his jaw. Emily leaned back in her seat, focusing on her breathing, calming her mind. This wasn't the kind of turbulence that bothered her. Her thoughts drifted to the past, the time she had been in far more dangerous situations, where every breath could have been her last. The memories came unbidden, like flashes of a distant, yet still raw reality. The dust rising in the air, the distant rumble of explosions, the rapid-fire commands shouted over the chaos of battle. She remembered the weight of her gear, the heat that pressed down on her skin, the faces of her fellow soldiers as they worked side by side, moving with precision and focus in the face of danger. The plane dipped suddenly, and a woman 2 rows ahead let out a small scream. Richard's grip on the armrest tightened even more, his knuckles white with tension. Emily noticed for the first time a flicker of something behind his eyes. Fear. Yes, but also something deeper, something personal. It wasn't just the turbulence that had him rattled. She turned to him, her voice calm and steady, the same tone she used with the frightened woman earlier. "It's going to be okay. The plane's just hitting a rough patch. This happens." Richard didn't respond right away. His eyes remained fixed forward, as if looking anywhere else might make the situation worse. Finally, after a long pause, he muttered, "Yeah, I know. Doesn't make it any easier." Emily could hear the strain in his voice, the effort it took for him to keep his composure. He sounded like someone who was used to being in control, but right now, there was no control to be had. The plane dipped again, and Richard let out a quiet, involuntary gasp. His tough exterior was cracking, and Emily felt a pang of understanding. "Sometimes," she said, "we have to let go of the things we can't control. Focus on what we can. Right now, it's breathing. In and out. Steady." Richard glanced at her for the first time since their unpleasant exchange at the start of the flight. His eyes lingered on her face, and something shifted between them. An acknowledgement, maybe, or simply the realization that she wasn't his enemy. He nodded stiffly, taking a deep breath, though his hands remained clenched on the armrests. Emily turned her attention back to the window. Outside, the sky was a hazy gray, the clouds thick and swirling. The turbulence wasn't as severe now, but it was enough to keep the passengers on edge. The flight attendants were moving through the cabin again, checking on people and offering reassurances. Emily noticed the way Richard's posture had softened slightly, his breathing more controlled. He was still tense, but there was something less rigid in the way he held himself. It reminded her of the soldiers she had served with, men and women who, when faced with moments of fear or uncertainty, had to rely on the people around them to stay grounded. The rest of the flight passed without much incident. The turbulence subsided, and the passengers gradually relaxed, though the atmosphere remained charged with residual anxiety. Emily could feel the shift in the cabin as people returned to their books, their movies, or their quiet conversations. As the plane began its descent, Emily could sense that something was weighing on Richard. His silence had changed. It wasn't the cold, dismissive silence from earlier. Now it felt heavy, like there was something he wanted to say, but didn't know how. She could feel his gaze flicker toward her every now and then, as if he were working up the courage to speak. When the plane finally touched down, there was a collective sigh of relief from the passengers. The wheels screeched against the runway, and the familiar jolt of landing pulled everyone back to the present moment. Emily was already gathering her things, her mind on her next steps, getting through the terminal, meeting her family, and most of all, the relief of finally being home. But as she stood up, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Richard standing awkwardly beside her, his face a mix of hesitation and something that looked like regret. I need to apologize," he began, his voice low but clear. "I shouldn't have acted the way I did earlier. It was uncalled for." Emily studied him for a moment, noting the tension still present in his eyes, the way his shoulders were slightly hunched, as if he was bracing himself for something. She had seen that look before, in soldiers and civilians alike. The look of someone carrying a weight they didn't know how to put down. "It's okay," she said quietly, though she didn't quite mean it. She knew what it felt like to be dismissed, to be looked down on, and she hadn't forgotten how it had felt when he first questioned her place in first class. But she also knew that an apology like this didn't come easily, especially from someone like Richard. "No, it's not," he continued. running a hand through his hair, a gesture that seemed to release some of his built-up frustration. "You didn't deserve that. You were just sitting in your seat, and I assumed things I had no right to assume. The truth is, I've got my own baggage, and sometimes it just comes out." Emily nodded, sensing that there was more to this than just the turbulence or the first-class seat. "We all carry things," she said simply, leaving the door open for him to share more if he wanted to. Richard hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "My brother," he said, his voice tight. "He was a soldier. Iraq. He didn't come back." Emily's heart sank. She had heard stories like this before, too many times to count. The faces of her fellow soldiers flashed before her, those who had made it home and those who hadn't. She didn't know what to say. What could she say? She hadn't lost a sibling, but she had lost friends, people who had been like family. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it. She could feel the weight of his grief, the bitterness that had built up over time, and she understood now why he had reacted the way he did. Richard nodded, his jaw clenched as if he were fighting back the emotions that threatened to spill over. "It's been years, but seeing you in that uniform, it just brought everything back. I took it out on you, and that wasn't fair." Emily met his gaze, her voice gentle but firm. "Grief doesn't go away easily. It stays with us, sometimes in ways we don't expect. But that doesn't make your brother's sacrifice any less meaningful. He served, and that's something to be proud of." Richard swallowed hard, nodding again, though his expression remained tight with the pain of old wounds. "I know," he said quietly. I wasn't ready to face it, I guess." They stood there for a moment, the noise of the disembarking passengers fading into the background as they shared a quiet, mutual understanding. Emily could feel the tension easing between them, the unspoken connection that comes from shared experiences, even when those experiences are different. As they moved toward the exit, Richard stopped again, as if there was something more he needed to say. He glanced down at the notebook Emily had tucked into her bag earlier. "You were writing something earlier, weren't you? On the plane?" Emily nodded. "I was. It helps me think sometimes." Richard shifted on his feet, looking unsure of himself. "Would you mind if I read it?" Emily paused, surprised by the request. She had written the letter with the intention of maybe giving it to him, but she hadn't been sure if he would be open to receiving it. Now it seemed like he was. She pulled out the notebook and carefully tore out the pages she had written. "It's not much," she said, handing them to him. "Just some thoughts." Richard took the pages, his fingers lingering on the edges for a moment before he tucked them into his jacket pocket. "Thanks," he said quietly. "I'll read it." They walked together through the terminal, neither speaking much, but there was no longer the awkward tension between them. When they reached the main concourse, Richard stopped again, his face softer now, more open. "Listen," he said, his voice tentative but sincere. "There's this veterans support group I've been going to. It's helped me a lot, even though I didn't think it would. I think it might help you too if you're interested." Emily considered the offer. She had never been one for support groups, preferring to handle her own struggles privately. But something about the way Richard spoke, his earnestness, the fact that he was reaching out despite his own pain, made her pause. "I'll think about it," she said, offering him a small smile. Richard nodded, looking relieved. "I hope you do. It might be good to talk with people who get it, you know?" Emily nodded in return. "Yeah, maybe." They parted ways soon after, but Emily felt lighter as she watched Richard walk away. There was something about the exchange, about the raw honesty of it, that stayed with her. Grief was a heavy burden, but in moments like this, when connections were made, it felt just a little bit lighter. As she moved through the terminal, her thoughts returned to her family. She had been so focused on getting home, on reuniting with them, that she hadn't expected to confront her own grief along the way. But now, after everything that had happened on the flight, she felt ready, not just to go home, but to move forward. When she finally saw her family waiting for her at the arrivals gate, her heart swelled with emotion. Her mother, her sister, her father, all of them stood there with open arms, ready to welcome her back. And as she stepped into their embrace, she knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where healing, understanding, and connection would guide her forward. The sound of the airport faded behind her as Emily sat in the small coffee shop inside the terminal, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. The space was quiet, a welcome contrast to the bustling crowds outside. She hadn't expected to be sitting here with a man who, just hours ago, had questioned her presence in first class. Now Richard sat across from her, a cup of coffee untouched in front of him, the weight of their earlier conversation still lingering between them. He had changed since their first tense interaction. His shoulders no longer carried the rigid defensiveness she had seen when he first boarded the plane. Instead, there was a kind of quiet humility in the way he held himself now, as if the turbulence on the flight had shaken loose something inside him. Emily could tell he was trying to find the words for what he wanted to say, but she didn't rush him. She had learned long ago that some silences were worth sitting through. Finally, Richard cleared his throat, breaking the stillness between them. "I read your letter," he said softly, pulling the folded pages from his jacket pocket and placing them on the table. His fingers brushed the paper lightly, almost as if it were something fragile. It meant a lot. I've been carrying around so much anger for so long. I guess I never really thought about what it's like for people like you. I mean, soldiers. I didn't want to think about it." Emily nodded, understanding the layers behind his words. The letter she had written on the plane had been less about herself and more about the idea of service, the quiet, often thankless duty that soldiers carried with them long after they took off the uniform. She hadn't expected him to respond so quickly or so deeply. "I didn't write it to change your mind," Emily said, her voice calm. "I just wanted you to understand that there's more to this life than what people see on the surface. It's easy to judge from the outside." Richard let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Yeah, I've been doing a lot of that. My brother. He was the strong one, you know? The one who wanted to be out there, making a difference. I was always the one sitting in offices behind desks. When he died, it felt like, I don't know, like I'd failed him somehow. Like I should have been the one out there instead of him." Emily listened quietly. She could hear the guilt in his voice, the way it weighed on him, even after all these years. It was a familiar burden, survivor's guilt. She had seen it in soldiers who came home from deployments, and she had felt it herself when her comrades didn't make it back. "You didn't fail him," she said softly. "What happened to your brother? It wasn't your fault. War takes people from us. Sometimes it's the ones we least expect, and there's nothing we can do about it." Richard's eyes softened, the hard edges of his grief beginning to crumble. "I've been angry for so long, at everything and everyone. It just felt easier than facing it, you know?" "I do," Emily said. She sipped her coffee, the warmth spreading through her hands. "Anger's easy. It gives us something to hold on to. But at some point, you have to let it go. Otherwise, it'll eat you alive." Richard nodded, his gaze distant, as if he were looking back at all the years he had spent clinging to that anger. For a moment, neither of them spoke, content to sit in the quiet of their shared understanding. Eventually, Richard leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "That veteran support group I mentioned. I think you'd really get something out of it. They've helped me a lot, even when I didn't want to be helped. It's a good group, people who've been through a lot of the same things you have." Emily hesitated. She had always been reluctant to join groups like that, preferring to handle her struggles on her own. But something about the way Richard spoke, how much the group had clearly helped him, made her pause. "I've never really been one for support groups," she admitted, her tone cautious. "I've always kind of felt like, I don't know, like I needed to deal with this stuff on my own." Richard smiled, a small, knowing smile. "Yeah, I used to think the same thing. But it's different when you're with people who get it. There's no judgment, no expectations. Just people who've been there, who know what it's like. Emily considered his words. Maybe it was time to try something different. She had spent so long carrying her burdens in silence, always assuming that was the only way to cope. But Richard was right. There was something to be said for sharing that weight with others who understood. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice sincere. "Maybe I'll check it out." Richard's smile widened, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "I think it would be good for you. It's not just about talking. It's about finding a way to move forward, to heal." They sat there for a while longer, talking about life, about their experiences, and about the long road that stretched ahead of them. By the time they finally stood to leave, Emily felt lighter, as if something had shifted within her during their conversation. Richard offered her one last smile before they parted ways, and as she watched him disappear into the crowd, she realized that this encounter had been more than just a chance meeting on a plane. It had been a reminder that even in moments of conflict, there was always the possibility for understanding and growth. As Emily stepped back into the airport terminal, her thoughts turned to her family. She had been away for so long, and the idea of finally seeing them again filled her with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Would they notice how much she had changed? Would they understand the things she had been through? She didn't know, but she was ready to find out. The moment she spotted them, her mother, her father, and her younger sister standing near the baggage claim, her heart swelled with emotion. Her mother's face lit up the second she saw Emily, her arms already outstretched, ready to pull her into a tight embrace. Emily quickened her pace, weaving through the crowds until she was finally in her mother's arms, the familiar scent of home filling her senses. Her father stood nearby, his eyes misty, but his expression stoic. He had always been the strong, silent type, but Emily could see the pride in his eyes as he looked at her. Her sister, on the other hand, couldn't contain her excitement, practically bouncing on her toes as she waited for her turn to hug Emily. "You're home?" her mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're finally home." Emily smiled, feeling the weight of her deployment lift from her shoulders. "Yeah, I am." As they gathered around her, asking questions, hugging her, and offering her all the love and support she could ever ask for, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had been through so much, had seen things that would stay with her forever. But in this moment, surrounded by her family, she knew she was finally where she belonged. Over the next few days, as she settled back into the rhythms of civilian life, Emily found herself thinking more and more about the conversation she'd had with Richard. His words lingered in her mind, especially when she found herself struggling to adjust to the quiet, mundane nature of life at home. The transition was harder than she had expected. The world felt different, slower, as if the pace of everyday life couldn't quite match the intensity of what she had been used to. It left her restless, unsure of how to fill the empty spaces. That's when she decided to give the support group a try. The first meeting was held in a small community center, a modest room filled with folding chairs arranged in a circle. Emily hesitated at the door, unsure if she was ready for this. But then she remembered Richard's words. No judgment, no expectations, just people who understood. That was enough to get her through the door. The group was small, no more than 10 people, each with their own story, their own struggles. Some were older veterans, others younger like her. The facilitator, a retired Marine, welcomed her with a nod, no need for introductions or explanations. They all knew why they were here. As the session began, Emily listened to the others share their stories, about the things they had seen, the losses they had endured, the ways they had tried to cope. There was no need to sugarcoat anything. This was a place for honesty, for raw, unfiltered emotion. And as Emily sat there, she felt a sense of solidarity that she hadn't felt in a long time. When it was her turn to speak, she hesitated. The words didn't come easily at first. But then she remembered that this was a space where she didn't have to pretend, where she didn't have to carry the weight alone. Slowly, she began to talk about her deployment, about the people she had lost, and about the uncertainty she felt now that she was back home. She talked about the difficulty of reconciling the soldier she had been with the person she was now. The words tumbled out, raw and honest, and when she was done, she felt a sense of release, as if a part of her had finally been unburdened. The others nodded in understanding. There were no platitudes, no attempts to fix anything. Just a shared acknowledgement of the pain and the journey they were all on. And that was enough. And after the meeting, the facilitator approached her with a kind smile. "You did good today," he said. "It's not easy to open up, but you did. That's a start." Emily nodded, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. "Thanks." It felt good to finally say some of that out loud. As she left the community center, she realized that this wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. She had spent so much time trying to carry her burdens alone, but now she understood that healing didn't have to be a solitary process. There were others who could help shoulder the load, others who could walk this path with her. And with that realization came a newfound sense of purpose. Over the next few weeks, Emily found herself thinking more about her future. She had always seen herself as a soldier, someone whose duty was to serve and protect. But now, she realized that there were other ways to serve, other ways to make a difference. She could still be a leader, still help people, but in a different capacity. One afternoon, as she sat in her living room with her family, a thought came to her. What if she started her own organization? Something that focused on bridging the gap between veterans and civilians. She had seen firsthand how easily misunderstandings and prejudice could arise, like with Richard. But she had also seen how those divides could be bridged through conversation, empathy, and shared experiences. The idea began to take shape in her mind, a space where veterans could share their stories, not just with each other, but with the broader community, a place where people could come together, learn from one another, and foster understanding. It wouldn't be easy, but Emily had never been one to shy away from a challenge. That evening, she shared her idea with her family. Her father, a veteran himself, looked at her with pride in his eyes. "That's a damn good idea, Emily," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You've always had a way of bringing people together. This could be something special." Her mother nodded in agreement. "You've been through so much, but you've never lost that sense of purpose. This could be a way for you to keep moving forward, to keep helping people." Emily smiled, feeling the warmth of their support. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity about where her path was leading. She wasn't just a soldier coming home from war. She was someone who could build bridges, who could bring people together in ways that mattered. In the weeks that followed, Emily began laying the groundwork for her new venture. She reached out to other veterans, community leaders, and organizations that could help support her vision. The process was slow, but with each step, she felt more confident that this was the right path for her. One day, as she sat at her desk, reviewing her plans, she received a message from Richard. He had been attending the support group regularly, and he wanted to thank her again for encouraging him to open up. His message was simple, but it meant more to her than he could have known. "I don't know where I'd be without that talk we had," he wrote. "Thanks for showing me that there's more to life than holding on to the past. I'm still figuring it out, but I think I'm finally ready to let go." Emily smiled as she read his words. In a way, they had both found something they needed that day on the plane, a sense of understanding, of connection. And now, as she prepared to embark on this new chapter of her life, she knew that she was ready to keep building those connections, one step at a time. Her journey wasn't over, it was just beginning. And with her family by her side, and the support of people like Richard, she knew that whatever came next, she was ready for it.